Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. We have an informative presentation on the important topic of domestic extremism, and we've got a great presenter for you. Before we get into the broadcast, let's quickly cover some logistics. If you get disconnected, please rejoin using the same link that you used to log in originally. Your microphone is muted, but you can submit questions at any time using the Q&A button. We have a lot of content planned today, and we'll do our best to address any questions that you might send. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll circulate a copy of the recording as well as a copy of the slides within 2 business days. My name is Andrew Saluk, and I'm your host. This webinar is presented by Topo AI. Our Topo One threat intelligence platform helps security teams respond faster to threats. We do this by mapping assets alongside threat intel from many sources onto one operating picture. And security teams use our product to support many security use cases. Here's one that's relevant for today's topic. Let's say that an intelligence analyst learns of threats from domestic extremist groups against state capitol buildings. The analyst is concerned about potential operational disruption to her company. So she decides to monitor all state capitol buildings that are located close to the company's office buildings. Topo One identifies all these office locations within 10 miles of a state capitol and creates a filter to alert the analyst to any threats that occur within that proximity. A proximate threat is reported by one of the analyst's intelligence feeds. The analyst can quickly zoom in and assess the threat. She can quickly determine potential impacts, notify colleagues, generate a situation report, or take other actions as appropriate. And this is one of the many ways that corporate security teams use Topo One. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Jenny Hesterman. She retired from the Air Force at the rank of colonel, and her final assignment was vice commander of Andrews Air Force Base. She is currently a vice president at Watermark Risk Management, and Jenny continues to research and teach graduate level security courses. Dr. Hesterman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Please do. The floor is yours.
All right. We'll get started. There we go. All right, now I just need to move this out of the way. Okay. So thank you everyone for being here today. And Andrew, thanks to you for inviting me. This is a great platform to talk about what I'm working on, and to Topo AI as well. Thank you so much. So today we're going to talk about this domestic extremism, what security teams should know. And everyone knows this is a very hot topic, and so much activity has happened this week around the topic. And so this webinar is very timely, and I'm going to present all of that to you in the next few minutes. Okay, so first, this is the agenda. We'll talk about the, excuse me, security landscape, ideology and extremism. Why do people radicalize? We'll talk about extremist groups, motivations, threats, and tactics, current government activity to counter DVE, lone actor terror, ideas for target hardening, insider threat, how can we deter, detect, and mitigate, and final thoughts. So this is a lot. We are going to pack a lot into this presentation, but as Andrew said, I'm providing you a copy of this presentation as a PDF file. So please don't take any time to take notes or take screenshots. You're going to have all of it. Just kind of listen and sink in. So first I want to talk about the security landscape. You know, there's so much happening right now in our country, and this topic of domestic extremism is just a part of it. In 2020, we had the highest number of mass shootings on record last year during the pandemic since the tracking started in 2012. And a mass shooting, just to explain, is 4 or more people killed or injured in an incident, excluding the perpetrator. That's the definition of a mass shooting. And also last year, we had the highest homicide rate in the United States that we'd had in many years. Most major US cities saw a spike. And we are on track for higher numbers this year. This is going to be the worst year potentially for mass shootings and for domestic violence and homicides. So why? What is happening? And what is happening is people are unraveling. They're in distress due to money, job, family issues, all sorts of things. So that's why I have this picture of the security landscape. It's really like this perfect storm. Last year also, human trafficking spiked, and illegal drug sales and use spiked during the pandemic. So who could have predicted that? But that's what happened. So really 2021 is just a continuation of what we saw in 2020. From the security perspective, see something, say something is not happening. If we're relying on people to tell us if they see something wrong. They're distracted, whether it's mask wear, which sometimes dulls your senses. Other issues, we already saw people were more inwardly focused before the pandemic, and now more so than ever. So they're not really our force multipliers like we'd like them to be out there. They feel like this is our new normal with violence. Some people just stop fighting what's happening in society, and they feel like it's not going to happen to me, not going to happen here. So a lot of things are happening, and this domestic extremism piece of it, you have to understand that it's fed by all this, and we're going to really talk about that. But I do use this picture because there's a sun there, glimmer, a little glimmer of light, glimmer of hope. There's a lot we can do. We shouldn't feel like we're helpless. So I really like this cartoon because it shows what happens with a normal person. They're in normal life, you're just like us, and all of a sudden they go to this dark space. Something happens, they're reaching out, they affiliate with a group, they're thinking violent thoughts, and then they move on to violence. And I like to use this because it does show that people are normal before this happens. And I think a lot of us probably know people right now who adhere to conspiracy theories and things like that we just can't believe. But it's important to know that they are normal, something happens, and then they go to this place. So what we try to do is figure out why, when they're in this dark space, how can we turn them around? Because once they've crossed over and they have violent intentions, it's almost impossible to off-road and off-track them. So it's easier as a security professional, a manager, a leader to do things like talk about budgets even, or strategic planning, than it is people. People issues are hard. Trying to understand people is very difficult, but we have to with this issue. Before we talk about fences and cameras and all sorts of security tools and implementations, we have to understand the humans behind it. So we're going to talk about ideology first. We're going to dig into what is ideology. And as you can see here, I'm not going to read the slides to you, but it's a body of concepts about a culture. It's content of thinking. It's theories that constitute a program. So really ideology it goes from a little idea, a small kernel of an idea, into a program that's then executed. And this statement from Karl Marx, they do not know it, but they're doing it. So really Marxism was all about this ideology, planting an ideology. The way that he did it was he told people, you have it bad. People are turning against you. They're rising up against you. You're backed in a corner, but I have the solution. I have the way out. And this is the way that he really brainwashed people to adhere to this ideology, where they would work and give all their wages to the government, without even questioning it. So these quotes here, that it's something absolutely vast and powerful beyond all perception and objective intelligibility, and ideology in you more than yourself. People who adhere to radical ideologies, it just becomes who they are. It's not just something that they do. And this is why it's so difficult to dislodge. And here's another artist rendering from a Saudi Arabian newspaper that really came out during the height of Al-Qaeda operations. And I thought this was really interesting because it just shows that, that this ideology, it trains a brain to turn around and head a different direction. And when I lived in the Middle East from 2013 to 2015, and I found that they share a lot of the same issues as us. For instance, a friend of mine, her son was being recruited for ISIS through his Game Boy. And it was just interesting that we share the same issues and the same problems. And again, it all comes down to humans are humans, right? It doesn't really matter what culture you're from, what country you're from. So I just think this is interesting. And it's sort of the sheeple idea. So why? What drives a rational person towards radical ideologies and groups? There's a lot of theories here. This is a soft sciences issue. This is a psychology issue. This is a sociological issue. And it's interesting and necessary to really understand why. So instinct theory, it's their instinct. It's not a conscious, purposeful, and rational decision. It's just an instinct that drives them towards these activities. Reinforcement theory. So their current behavior is affected by knowledge of rewards for similar past behaviors. So maybe they've seen other people get press coverage for an attack that they carried out. And they're thinking about the reward that they could get. And then cognitive theory. So this is expectations, right? This is what could happen in the religious, like in the jihadism, where they think that if they carry out an attack, that there's something waiting for them on the other side, type of thing. So again, this is really This is really a deep issue. I mean, to talk about people and what's happening in people, but we need to understand whether it's our employees that we're concerned about this happening to, our family members, and also just for ourselves to understand how we could possibly even be exposed to and start to adhere to these ideologies. So the need for affiliation, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. All humans are on this continuum throughout our life, but really focus in on this love and belonging, a person's need to feel a sense of involvement and belonging to a social group. So anxiety and stress feed the need for affiliation. And there's so many examples of it, even with us. You know, if you find out that you have a disease, you're going to go online probably and look for a support group of other people who can help you. If you're dieting, if you're exercising, we all reach out, we all look for our people, right? So it's the same with these radical and extremist groups. And what happened during the pandemic is it fed the beast for this. Everybody was online, for starters. People felt isolated and lonely. People were angry, they were scared. And so what happened was that these groups stepped up. They saw those vulnerabilities and they exploited it to feed their needs. So the influence of ideology, it's powerful and it can't be underestimated. It's a powerful force that can quickly change society. We've seen that throughout history with examples in Russia and China at a state level, a nation state level, and especially in communities. We can see this now. It shifts the cognitive center of gravity. So, you know, people that normally had these rational thoughts, it shifts that. And you can see now how difficult it is to dislodge. It can be political, economic, religious, or single issue. There's many ideologies, and it's hard to dislodge. It becomes this battle of ideas, right? So we're telling them, you're wrong, you know, and we have to replace that with something. So we have to explain what's correct. But what we have now are people don't believe they don't believe the press, they don't believe the government, they don't believe experts. And so for us to think that we can dislodge these ideologies, I mean, it's just very naive. And this is the dilemma. And this is why we don't have a de-radicalization program in our country, even for Americans that were recruited by ISIS and recruited by Al-Qaeda. And it's very scary because the Americans that we prosecuted who were influenced by Al-Qaeda, that either plotted or tried to carry out attacks, they're all out of jail now. They've served their sentence in the US and they're back in our society without any kind of rehabilitation. So we do need a de-radicalization program, but every time the steps in that direction, it becomes really complicated. How do we address this? How do we deconstruct these ideologies? We're still struggling with that. So I was in the Air Force, and when I was stationed at the Pentagon the first of 3 times, I went to Johns Hopkins for night school and on the weekend to get a master's degree in applied behavioral science with an emphasis in organizational development. And while I was there, my instructor had us read this work by Gareth Morgan. And so he actually wrote this back in, I think, 1993. And I didn't understand it when I read it. And what Morgan said was perhaps organizations are really socially constructed realities that rest as much in the heads and minds of members as they do in concrete sets of rules and relations. And I thought, you know, what is Morgan talking about? I was at the Pentagon. We had this hierarchy. We had a boss who had, you know, then there was another layer, another layer, another layer. And this was before the internet. This is way before Facebook, you know, which didn't come around till 2004, and Twitter was 2006. I mean, really, these are social networking and social media is really a new phenomena. But now I realize he is a genius, right? He saw what was happening with organizations, and that they are not a place. An organization is really the socially constructed reality with ideology as the glue. And so as I go through the presentation at the bottom, I'll have extra material that you can read up on if something's of interest. And so this book, Images of Organization, is really fascinating. 2006 is the recent edition. And then the book, The Starfish, the Spider, and the Unstoppable Power of Leaderless Organizations. This is just a really fantastic book because a lot of these groups now that we're seeing, they are leaderless, right? It's just the ideology that keeps everybody together. So more theory. Extremist groups do not have a unique culture, okay? A group is a group. It recruits. It provides moral support. Sometimes it feeds and it houses and it shelters. It retains people. It fights to keep people in the group. Really, groups are groups. Group theory shows what a group consists of, how people communicate, how they fight, everything. It's the same. So these groups are not unique. I think sometimes when we look at groups as unique, then we're looking to tailor some kind of solution to that group, whether it's Boogaloo Bois or ISIS or whatever. But really, if you peel it all back, groups are all the same, and we can use the same solution set against all the groups. The force at play is collectivism. The group has priority over the individuals. The group gives members a sense of identity, and it demands loyalty, or subtly elicits loyalty for the sense of security. Like, we'll take care of you. If you go out and you commit this attack, we'll take care of you. We've got your back. We've seen some of this in with new groups in the past year and a half. People are going out and they're doing things, and they're assuming that this group is going to protect them somehow, and they end up getting themselves in a lot of trouble. And the individual is beholden to the group, and they're knowingly used. Sometimes they're fine with being used and exploited. And this is when this affiliation, that you're part of this group, turns into the group dominating you, dominating the individual. So culture is really important. So when we talk about ISIS and other types of terrorist organizations, and we think about how to dismantle them, this is how we look at these groups. What are the values? What's the value system? What are the acceptable behaviors and the group norms? What are the artifacts? All groups have some kind of dates, symbols, colors, dress. Now we see patches, types of shirts, things like that. These are the artifacts of the group. This is what leads to cohesion of the group and what holds them together. And then the environment, is it a closed system or open? That's important for law enforcement, for intelligence agencies. Can we get in there and find out what's happening on the inside? Like we can perhaps with some type of gang or drug trafficking organization, something like that? Or is it a closed system? Is it impossible to get in on the inside and find out what's happening? And when they're pre-planning, and we need to find out what their tactics are or what they're aspiring to. So this is how we look at groups. And again, the groups we're seeing when they come out, these are good questions to ask, because this is how we find out how we can counter what's happening. And I wanted to leave this quote in here, although I use it in my Al-Qaeda and ISIS and terrorism presentation, but I think it's really fascinating because it talks about culture. So what happens here is that, what Hechthammer says is militancy is more than bombs and doctrines. It's also rituals, customs, dress codes, music, films and storytelling, sports, jokes, and food. So with these groups, yes, they may go out and commit some type of an attack, or some type of an event where they all show up in mass, but also all this other stuff is happening, right? With some of these groups, we see they're even like tailgating before they go out and do things, and there's music, and so there's a lot more that's feeding the individual's need here for affiliation than just to rise up against something. And many jihadists see themselves as historical heroes, knights in shining armor. So a lot of times with these groups, people were told, like, you're going to be a hero, you're going to make a name for yourself, this is your legacy, and people believe it. So going into extremism now, extremism is advocacy of extreme views, having distorted and divergent interpretations, beliefs, and values. So we all probably have a religion that we adhere to, or atheism, or agnostic, whatever we are. We have an ideology, but we're not extremist about it. We can be in the same room together. We can talk about it. It's fine what you believe, what I believe, it's fine. But extremism starts to get into this. It's not fine. Okay, what I believe is right and you're wrong. And this is when you start to see people move on the scale on ideology into the extremist area. And it's radicalism. So radicalism is being persuaded or coerced into favoring extreme changes. So now they want to change the system, whether it's views, habits, conditions, or institutions. So there's two types of extremism, and one is nonviolent. So this is the written and verbal extremism. And I use Al-Awlaki as a perfect example. Al-Awlaki never pulled the trigger, but he had plenty of blood on his hands, which is why the United States and
Bear with us just a moment, everyone. It looks like we're having some
his
AV
voice.
difficulty. Oh, there you are again, Jenny. The audio faded out a bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
Please.
great. Sorry about that. So Anwar al-Awlaki is an example of nonviolent extremism. And if, in case you didn't hear me, I said that he didn't pull the trigger, but he has plenty of blood on his hands. And then we have the violent gun bullet extremism. So this is John Georgelis, born in Texas, lived a nondescript life, and all of a sudden ISIS recruited him on the internet. He goes to Syria. I believe that he died in a US attack there. So Nonviolent extremism, though, is really important. About it's radical preaching, writing, and think tanks. And some of these groups, there's an anarchist think tank that's very academic type of activities. And sometimes we let groups, we let them have these think tanks, right? We let them write things, we let them gather, and it's seen as an event. You know, we let them have their platform, but it doesn't further peace and harmony. It inspires, incites recruiting, boosting around fundraising. So is an area that we have difficulty addressing because of First Amendment and other things feeding these groups. And here's a great book to read, Violent and Nonviolent Extremism, Two Sides of the Same Coin. So violent extremism, what we're talking about today, what we see are people have the perception of being marginalized, discriminated against, even ridiculed. We see that a lot now on social media where people are called names for what they believe and persecuted. And they can't live with opposing views. Like I said before, they can't coexist anymore. So the options are to convert you or to eliminate you. And they often think their beliefs and way of life are under attack. So like anyone who's backed in a corner, they feel like, you know, potentially violence is the only way to get out. But it's complicated. Not all people who adhere to violent ideology really buy that ideology 100%. Maybe the actor has a superficial attachment to the ideology, but has other grievances and seeks revenge. And we're seeing that with groups right now. They're coerced into participating, they're paid, manipulated, or shamed. And these are all examples. I've got case studies for all these, how people have been have ended up in these groups in different ways. And the original hook sometimes evolves into greed for money, greed for power, status, or attention. So what originally got them there isn't what keeps them. And then sometimes violent extremism becomes a career. And there's a body of work out there that talks about Al-Qaeda and ISIS and how the terrorists, you know, it's their career now. It wasn't just a flash in the pan. It's something that they're doing as a career, for a living. So the catalyst, so obviously it's the internet. We all know that. I just pulled this down. It's interesting how many people were on YouTube, Facebook, all these sites. And what happens is, after I retired from the military, I was a cleared contractor for the government, and I did a lot of work on exploitation of the internet. And so I was in chat rooms, I was talking to people, I was on LinkedIn looking for people, all sorts of things. And what I found was that people don't realize who they're talking to. You know, they want to be helpful. For instance, on LinkedIn, you know, if people ask questions about their job or where they used to work, they want to be helpful. We all want to be helpful as humans, but they don't know who they're talking to. And it's really scary how quickly they can become radicalized as well. For ISIS, for example, during the pandemic, they were online 24/7 looking for disgruntled Americans to recruit, and they were successful. We had several plots last year that were uncovered, thankfully, against hotels, against college campus, against the White House. So during the pandemic, we were all online, as I said before, and the internet just provides instant interface between recruiters and recruits. That's the way I look at them. And it's 24/7 access to tactical information. Anything you want to find on the internet, you want to build. Now we have 3D printers, drone printers, things like that. It's really scary. So when I did work on some of these issues, I found that the social media companies were not really partnering with us. If something happened where they were used by a terrorist group or by a group, they acted like they were victims as well. Okay, so it's starting to change a little bit, 20 years too late, and you can't put this genie back in the bottle. There's a strategy that all groups use, online recruitment strategy. So what they do is they seek people out who are disgruntled, disaffiliated, whatever. Most people are out there with their real names, talking about how they feel about everything. So they seek them out and they isolate them. You know, don't tell anybody that we're chatting. The reason they do that is because a family member may try to talk them out of it, you know, or a friend may say, "You're crazy. Why are you talking to them?" So they want to isolate people, and then they encourage them. And this can take time. This could be a process over a couple months, even years, or it could just take weeks, as in the case of the Ohio State stabbing. And so in Ohio State, we had a student, his last name is Artan, and he was a 4.0 student. He was a community college 2-year graduate, moved to Ohio State. He asked the college if there was a place for him to worship. He was Muslim, and they didn't get back to him with an answer. There was a place for him to worship, but he didn't know it. So he went on Facebook. He started to complain about Ohio State and about how there's no place for him to worship. ISIS recruited him, and he actually went to his Home Depot where he worked, where he was Employee of the Month, bought a knife, and got in his car, called in a fire alarm, or I think he called it maybe a bomb threat, into his building where the chemistry class was being held. When everybody flushed out, he drove into the crowd and got out and started stabbing people. And literally this recruitment of him took about 10 days. So with the internet, as you can see, things are really on a fast timeline. So primary challenges, the battlefield's in the mind. As we said, we talked a lot about what's happening in people's minds. Battlefield isn't a place, I always say, with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which, by the way, while everyone's on the line, it's important to know that ISIS has regrouped, and yes, it's splintered, but it's actually growing stronger. And with Al-Qaeda, we're seeing a more sophisticated version of Al-Qaeda this time. I'd say it's like Al-Qaeda 5.0. And they are heavily engaged in what's happening in the United States. They're putting out a glossy magazine. It's the last one was 70 pages, I believe. It's called One Ummah. I have a copy of it that's a clean copy I'd be happy to share with you. They know what's happening in the United States. They're dissecting it at a very academic, analytic, and accurate level. And they're looking for ways to exploit that. So while we're focused on the pandemic and cyber attacks and all the things happening, we need to remember that these groups are still out there and viable. And I always say with them, like the battlefield is in Afghanistan or Syria or whatever, it's in the mind. It's the ideology. Ideology is the glue, the internet's the vehicle. Not sophisticated attacks from these types of groups. I'm now back to domestic violent extremists, nor overly ambitious missions, but this is that death by 1,000 cuts. And that's what bin Laden wanted for America. He wanted fabric of society to pull those threads, to split us in half as a country, to turn us against each other, to bankrupt us. So this is that slow death, basically, that we see when these groups act out, and it plants fear, sows seeds of doubt about the government's ability to protect us. And politicization, it's a hard word, often halts progress. And this is a screenshot from the FBI's former program about extremism, and it was called Don't Be a Puppet. It was this fantastic program that they had online. What is violent extremism? What are extremist groups? How to recognize you're being recruited. And unfortunately, they had to pull the whole program down. And I won't get into all that here. But anytime that we politicize security, that's a bad thing. And healthcare, as we're finding out as well. It halts progress. So the FBI has their definition of domestic violent extremism. I won't read it to you, but I think what's really important, and I'm going to highlight this later as well, is that at the bottom, mere advocacy of political or social positions, political activism, strong rhetoric, or even the generalized philosophic embrace of violent tactics may not constitute violent extremism, and it may be constitutionally protected. And this is the problem in our country. First Amendment is wonderful. Of course, we want the First Amendment. It's what makes the U.S. the U.S. But it's an issue in this area. It's a problem in terms of not only arresting people, but then later prosecuting them. It's definitely causing great issues. So extremism in the U.S., these are the groups that we talk about. And you might recognize some of these also as terrorist groups or terrorist movements. But sometimes, terrorism is also extremism, not always. And extremism can be terrorism, but not always. This is a very complicated issue. And that's why it takes a complex skill set to understand and also to engage. It's very difficult to just have one solution against all of this. So we have right wing, we all know what that is, left wing, religious, most dangerous, extremism, because they're apocalyptic, they feel like they're martyrs, they feel like their actions are sanctioned by a higher being. That's where we would probably see the weapons of mass destruction, whether it's chem, bio, agro, things like that. And then single interest, animals, people who protect plants and trees, and climate change people. So as I said before, I've engaged in conversation with a lot of these type of people, and it's always stunning to realize that they would, kill us or kill you over an animal or over a plant. And it's hard to understand, but we have to wrap our minds around it, that people really believe this ideology, and they're extremists, and then they take it to violent extremism, not to be overlooked or just kind of pushed aside. And then the wild card. So these are the groups that we've seen in the last couple of years, the incel attacks. And Elliot Rodger was the first one out in California when he went on the shooting spree. I believe it was in Santa Barbara, but also the yoga studio in Tallahassee. Even the two school mass shootings had some of this incel or misogynist type of underlying cause or reason. And then groups like the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys. So these groups are really popping up on the scene in the last couple years. And we're going to talk about Boogaloo Boys. I wrote an article about this last year. Probably the most interesting group that I've ever looked into since I started all this. And really, it just started as a joke. It was this meme. They used this igloo. They had, just silly things online. They had a couple Facebook pages. Really, it was like ridiculous stuff. And then they started to show up at protests, right? And why I said that the group is interesting is because when I researched it, I found everyone in this group. I found white supremacists. I found Black Lives Matter. I found anarchists. It was this weird confluence of ideologies in this group, but the one thing that held them together was anti-government. It was anti-law enforcement. It was exactly what it was. So in the middle here, you see when they started to show up with their Hawaiian shirts, and this, it seemed like nonsense, but they had some serious firepower. And then on the right, this is Stephen Carrillo. So Carrillo was a staff sergeant in the Air Force. He was security forces, and not only that, he was highly trained as a sniper, as a counter sniper. And so he was influenced by the Boogaloo Boys, and he committed a murder. He, as a sniper, took out a law enforcement officer who was standing in front of state capitol house. And I want to say it was in Sacramento. And then when they went to his house to arrest him, he also had booby trap and killed another police officer. So it's not a joke. So I think one of the biggest takeaways that we need to have from these groups is when they start and we kind of just push them aside and we think it's just a big joke, that we need to take it seriously from the beginning, because by the time we did take the Boogaloo Boys seriously, they had 13 Facebook pages. They were communicating clandestinely through apps. They'd grown to 14 or 18,000 people, and they were showing up everywhere. So just something to think about when a new group pops on the scene. From your security planning perspective, you should start to think, how might I be targeted? Like, why would they come after us? Is there something that we do in our business that would trigger them somehow? Or how can we protect ourselves from this? So definitely don't marginalize these type of groups. DVEs of greatest concern. So this is hard because they're all of concern, but the FBI did just come out a few weeks ago with their new warning about QAnon. And they're seeing a resurgence of QAnon chatter, websites, things like that. And I think more violent talk, more violent chatter. And so they wanted to warn, like, let's not forget about this movement, this ideology. And they say that they're moving from serving as digital soldiers, so online type activities, to taking action in the real world. So find this report online, this adherence to QAnon conspiracy theory by some domestic violent extremists. And again, like I said before, these are human beings. They're rational human beings before this ideology was introduced to them. And it doesn't help to call people who adhere to these types of things, idiots or whatever you see online. That's not helpful. That is really a trigger in a lot of ways. And when I see that, I cringe, because I just think that it's feeding the fire. It's dumping gas on the embers. Anarchists. So anarchist extremists, we're seeing anarchists, and I saw them last year at a lot of the protests. They're taking advantage of the civil unrest to show up, and they like to lash out against law enforcement. And so they're just joining right in the crowd. A couple of the events last year, when I was watching video, and if I'd stop on different screen grabs, I saw anarchists in the crowd. They will just hinge onto whatever's happening, show up, and then try to advance their own agenda. Also, I see an A a lot of places, and people jump to the conclusion that that's anti-fascist or Antifa, but it's not. It's anarchist symbol. So we also need to be careful when we dissect what's happening to make sure we get it right. And militia. The militia is always a concern in the United States. They stockpile a lot of weapons. They adhere to a lot of strange conspiracies. They are off the grid. They are off the radar. And they show up as well. I saw them showing up a lot last year and some this year too, but they're starting to fire up again. So the rhetoric is getting strong because of gun control. because of the border, immigration, things like that. So I would say these are the three that we really need to focus in on right now. Well, just this week, the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism came out, and I had a look at it. There's a three-pronged strategy, 3 pillars, that's broken down into certain areas. Definitely have a look at it. I really like that they said that this project should unite all Americans, and that we have to together say that this domestic terrorism has no place in our society. We have to come together as citizens and fight this together. So just yesterday, I was on a call, and it was hosted by the George Washington University Center for Extremism, Program for Extremism. And John Cohen was on. He's the coordinator for CT and the assistant secretary and threat prevention at DHS. And it was public, and so I've taken some of his comments here for you. First of all, he said the FBI has 2,500 open domestic terrorism cases. That's not just Boogaloo Bois and groups like that. That's all domestic terrorism. Those are ISIS Americans who are either providing support to ISIS, chatting with ISIS, same with Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah. So 2,500 open cases of US citizens engaging in this. And they also have over 1,000 foreign terrorist organization cases as well. So they're really busy. He said the most significant terrorist threat to the US are lone actors or small groups based on an ideological group they connected with online, a combination of beliefs and personal grievances. He said that the threat comes from people who have a superficial understanding of the ideology. They're angry, disconnected, treated unfairly, and participating in these groups provides a sense of self-worth. So just like we said. Now, he also said that the challenge that they have from the law enforcement and from DHS perspective is these constitutionally protected activities and threats and violence. So trying to distinguish between free speech and threats. And he said we failed a few times, and he gave a few examples of when they could have intervened and they didn't, and something bad happened. So again, understanding extremism and understanding when that moves into the violent extremism, and understanding the difference between the pen and writing and speaking versus the violence, and how that's really a fine line between those. He said communities need to engage, and so they're really focused right now on helping communities identify high-risk individuals, off-road them from what they want to do, and take care of them. This is a new concept for communities. Had we had a de-radicalization program for the Americans who were influenced by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, we would already have this on the shelf. We've tried to go there as a country a few times. There was a bill on the House floor that died twice to have a center for de-radicalization. That would have involved communities, sort of like the sex offender type of thing, where there's a registry. And so people are more engaged. They know who's in the neighborhood. But communities aren't prepared for this, but this is where we're heading as a nation. Probably because people are more trusting at the local level, more trusting of their local politicians, more trusting of local law enforcement. We have a lot of progress when we do activities at the local level, vice coming down from federal government. So really look for these new programs. There's a lot of money attached to this community engagement project. And this DVE is now a top priority. 7.5% of DH funds are going to go to that this year. Improving communication and information sharing between agencies, same thing since 9/11, still issues with culture, lack of trust. It's historical, it's based in past things, it's hard to fix. And then again, helping communities with tools and programs. And there's a huge grant program right now for communities to get involved with as well. So lone actor terror, we just mentioned that a couple minutes ago. We don't call it lone wolf anymore. You won't see wolf. The word wolf kind of aggrandized these actors. It sort of made them, almost not superhero-ish, but it just gave them, it was just the wrong word to use. So actors, lone actors, like bad actors. Terror undertaken by individuals who prepare for and execute violence without external assistance, often draw the ideological inspiration from formal organizations, but they're on the fringes, and they can mount high profile, extremely destructive attacks, as we know. And there's two types of lone actors. And again, for your employees, this is something to potentially keep an eye on. Some people just disconnect, right? They just leave society. That's Stephen Paddock up there in the top left from the Las Vegas shooting. He just left society, right? He made a choice. And he's well adapted to society, mentally fit. We never found out why he committed the massacre in Las Vegas. He just detached, or society leaves them, so you think about the Sandy Hook shooter locked in his room, you just hope he goes away and everything's fine. There's this great countering lone actor terrorism project that's happening in the Netherlands, and so you can visit their website for more on that. Lone actor attacks way up, and we saw just in Nashville, the one in Nashville, which was a suicide attack, and thankfully he gave warning. It could have been a lot different if that was Saturday afternoon with no warning in downtown Nashville. But here's a great book, Age of Lone Wolf Terrorism. So what are your concerns? Concern number one would maybe be that this DVE activity is somehow going to put your organization in the crosshairs, potentially based on the type of work that you do, the type of people that you have in the workplace, a decision that your company made that you had no idea about, things like that. So possibly this brings danger to your doorstep, but you have to continuously assess the threat. You have to understand who's talking about you on social media. A lot of times when I do work with clients, for instance, malls, a couple years ago, I did a project in a major US city to protect 6 malls against terrorist attack. And at the time, those flash mobs were popular where these kids would text each other and get on Twitter and say, hey, meet down at the mall. And then like 1,000 of them would show up and run through and destructive and scare everybody. So we got them to start looking at Twitter. What are people saying about your mall? Get out ahead of this. And it actually helped one of the malls prevent a flash mob. So you have to constantly assess the threat and who's talking about you, what's happening out there. It takes a lot of people to do this. Maybe it's manpower you don't have. There's technology, like Andrew mentioned earlier, to fill in the gaps for you for this. Or you're not the target, but you're caught up in escalating violence. And that happens a lot, especially in cities where you're not the target, but all of a sudden people are trying to get into your organization or into your building to hide. Do you let them in? Do you lock the door? These are questions that my clients ask me. But the number one thing is your ability to deter attack, whether it's you're the threat, or I'm sorry, you're the target or you're not the target, is to understand your vulnerability. That's the number one thing. And you have to identify your vulnerabilities. The best way to do it is to use an assessment tool. The one that I use was the FBI used after 9/11 in communities. The language is clear. There's no acronyms. And I can send you a copy of that, certainly. But it asks a lot of great questions, and you score. So I believe there's 13 scored sections. And at the end, you have an overall total. And it tells you how vulnerable that you are to certain types of attack. So first, identify your vulnerabilities. And next, you have to prioritize everything can't be a vulnerability that you need to cover. And obviously we all don't have unlimited resources to do this. So I used effects-based hardening. It's applied from a military model that we use in the Air Force for operations. It's a way to visualize violent scenarios in an unemotional, data-driven way, because when you talk to people about terrorism and being attacked and mass shootings, it's fear right away. People are fearful. And to really do your security planning in an effective way, you have to remove all that from the discussion and really get down into the data. And then harmonize, synchronize, and prioritize your security activities. Find your Achilles heel. So what I tell people is, what is the number one thing if the bad actor could get to that's going to bring your whole organization to its knees? What is that? And then cover it. Use your resources to cover that and do something. So let's say you need to replace all the locks on your doors and you don't have the money for that. Which doors are the most vulnerable? Fix that, because I find people are paralyzed and then they do nothing, which is the worst possible thing you could do. Apply hard target tactics. So, we protect military bases, we protect buildings, government buildings, and you can use all those types of hardening activities for your own organization. These are just some ways. Every slide that I present to you today is its own briefing, so I'm really just hitting the high point. Conceal, cover, disguise, lower the heat. Let's say you have signage up that's a trigger to people, take it down. This is when I lived in the Middle East, I saw this happening. If there was some type of an event that was starting to bubble up, people would start pulling their flags down, pulling their signs down. They don't want triggers to be out there in front of their organization. Deter, using security language on your websites. What do your websites say about security? That you're doing bag checks or that you have a security presence, and then change that, alter it as the situation in the environment is heating up. Make yourselves look as hard as possible so bad actors don't even try. And social media, what are you saying about what's happening at your property or around the property, or how you're prepared to take care of your people, for instance? And deceive. We use deception. I was a tactical deception officer in the Air Force, and it's all Sun Tzu, look big when you're small, loud when you're quiet, things like that. There's ways, and I'm happy to talk to you offline about that. So if you don't have resources for security, how to look like a hard target, harder than you are. And just remember, the best defense is a good offense. And rings of security. When I was the base commander at Andrews, we had Air Force One, but we also had 20,000 people on the base that I was responsible for protecting every day. But this is what we use in the military. So we put the target at the center. So whatever that target is, whatever that Achilles heel is, if it's cyber, it could be your people, and it could be paper records. Whatever it is, you put it at the center, and you put these rings of security, these tripwires around it, so that as the bad actors get close, they're deterred, they're off-roaded, maybe they're detected, and you know that they're coming, and you can change plans accordingly, or they have to change their plans and they're frustrated. So security doesn't start at the front door of a building. It's in the parking lot. It's on the sidewalks. It's also out in the perimeter. It's in the community. At Andrews, when I was a base commander, I knew everybody on the outside of the base. I knew the Arby's manager. I knew the McDonald's. We had 2 hotels out there. We had gas stations. I knew all of them because they could see what was happening outside the fence of the base that I couldn't see from the inside from my office, and that paid off a few times. And again, the internet, what are people saying about your organization? Who is threatening you? And a lot of people who are involved in things right now and carry out attacks, they've already had these ideations online, and we always peel it back. They were on Facebook, they were on Twitter saying what they were going to do. They're saying it. How do you know that? And how can you protect your people and your organization? Concern number 2 is insider threat. And I will say at Department of Defense, the #1 security concern right now is insider threat. So it should be everybody's #1 concern. In case you didn't know, there's a National Insider Threat Task Force. It's in the Director of National Intelligence Office. And this is the definition of insider threat. Again, you'll have my slides. But visit their website, a lot of really good information. There's 5 categories of insider threat. There's leaks. That's when people intentionally disclose proprietary information. There's spills. They've messed up through writing or a press interview and leaked. Espionage, they're selling it. They're giving it to your competitors, a foreign nation, with the intent to do harm to the organization. Or sabotage. They're deliberately destroying, damaging, or obstructing on your work sites or in your office buildings. And then targeted violence, which we're talking about today. So the definition is targeted violence is any type of violence directed at an individual or group for a specific reason. It's not a random act. And so we're talking about active shooters, stabbers. Do not discount stabbing. I recently wrote a paper on stabbing, the increasing amount of stabbings, and they're deadly. And even if they don't kill as many people, if you stab someone in the organs, like a kidney or whatever else, you've basically ruined their life. And also bombings, bomb threats. And again, I have a whole presentation on bomb threat response. Should you evacuate when you're in a perfectly good building? When most bomb threats, almost 99% of bomb threats don't result in a bombing. And we have potentially bad actors outside waiting to ambush, truck into crowd. Those are the big tactics. So be prepared, think about all these things. Assault, threats, and threatening behavior. So somebody asked in the questions before the seminar, would somebody who's a domestic violent extremist in one of these ideologies, would they do some damage in the workplace? And absolutely they would. And there's a couple cases where, and I think there was a train driver in California who purposely derailed the train because he wanted to draw attention to his cause. So yes, it could happen, and it's not to be discounted. Really, for insiders, your biggest threat is an insider, is someone in your organization, because they have the keys to the kingdom, right? They know everything about the organization. They have access. They know all the vulnerabilities. They know when everybody's, when the security guard takes lunch, they can leave a back door open. They can give blueprints to the building. So they're the most serious threat to your organization. So vulnerabilities, we're all humans. We all have vulnerabilities. No one's immune. Not everybody who has vulnerabilities is a potential insider threat, but they do increase the risk that an insider could be exploited, recruited, and decide to commit any of the other things we talked about, espionage, sabotage, or targeted violence. And adversaries are actively looking for vulnerabilities to exploit. They're looking for people in your organization who are melting down. They're probably online. And they're actively recruiting them for their own needs. And these are just some behaviors that we've seen, changes in personality, substance abuse, or addictive behaviors. Financial change, either affluence or excessive debt, which a lot of people are struggling financially right now. You have to think about how that could impact your organization, what they could sell or steal possibly. They're disgruntled. Workplace shootings are way up. We had the San Jose Transit Authority. We had the FedEx facility in Indianapolis. People are angry at their employers right now for different reasons. So we really need to have good workplace violence programs in place. If they feel disaffected, marginalized, or alienated, if someone's attached to one of these ideologies like QAnon and they're in the workplace talking about it and people are saying, they're triggers like, well, you're stupid if you believe that or whatever else. Again, we need to realize these are humans, and how are humans going to respond to that? And how are they going to respond in the workplace? We see that they start disregarding security altogether, and then they're on social media or in the workplace. They're talking about what they're going to do. So should you monitor social media? Yes. If someone's on social media, that's public. They're in the public saying what they're saying. So I'm for monitoring. Talk to your lawyers just in case. So these are the key messages from DoD on insider threat. And I think the words are really important. This is what we're telling our people. Seeking assistance to help deal with life's challenges is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of good judgment, an act of bravery to say, I need help. Identifying your colleagues who need help is not an act of betrayal. It's the act of respect for safety and well-being of the individual, the organization, the community, and the nation. This is great language to use in your organization. And I'm really proud of DoD for this insider threat training. They thought that insider threat was such a pressing issue that over Christmas, there was a group of folks that worked on a 16-week program that they just did the demo for, or the test for this spring on insider threat. So there's a lot you can harvest from their program online and use in your own program. Don't have to reinvent the wheel. So we're almost at the end here. Insider threat, we call it the fifth column. It's a group of people that are sympathetic or working for the adversaries, which the groups that we talked about today are the adversaries. You can't assume that serious insider threats are Nemo, not in my organization. We want to believe everybody's loyal, but as we said before, people are melting down for different reasons. And what danger could that bring to your doorstep? Groups will use employees, as I said, stockpile blueprints, info, access, leave the back door open. These are all real world case study examples. The hiring process is critical. I find my organizations I consult with, they have a great hiring process. Onboarding is okay. There's maybe a last minute check, but then once the employee is in the organization, they just forget about them completely. They just assume that they're loyal and everything's fine. And what in the government is a great place to look for an example of insider threat programs, because people have security clearances, and if they start to melt down, we have to pull their clearance and their access. So just remember, everyone has a public life, a private life, and a secret life. And really that secret life is where they're unraveling. That's where the gambling, alcohol abuse, domestic problems, financial issues, that's the unraveling. That's what's going to bring danger to your doorstep. So how do you find that out without spying on your employees? First, have a culture of safe reporting. Use that language that we had before. Tell people it's okay to come out with information on your colleagues. Plus, have a mechanism for your employees to report that as well. And read this book. It's a great book, Managing Insider Threat, No Dark Corners. It is a program. And again, it's the not spying on your employees, but how to know if they're unraveling. So what else can we do? Be attuned to the human condition. Again, what's happening in society, and how does that help or hinder our security efforts? There's a large body of thought out there in violent extremism for you to read. You have to know what's going on with the groups. It's changing every day. Groups, activities, their targets, and their tactics. And you have to adjust your security plans. Your security plan should never just be static. It can't be on the shelf anymore. It has to be tailored to what's happening in society. And remember that human element, the most difficult to address in the security realm, but can make or break our efforts. Are humans the weakest link, or are they our biggest asset? Understanding this is complex, as we've said a couple times, it requires a complex response. It's not easy, but there's many solution sets. We're not helpless, and we shouldn't just think this is the new normal. If we stop fighting, that's what the bad actors want. They want that leverage. They want to be able to come in, and do what they want to do. And if we stop fighting, we're giving them that. We're opening the door for them. And then to understand just we're part of the environment and the problem, to understand triggers, whatever kind of language that we use. What are we doing to contribute to this problem in society, and how can we help? How can we better what we're doing, what our organization is doing? It's powerful tools. And then another thing I wanted to talk about was really this focus on cyber. There's a lot of focus on cyber with ransomware. Of course, you have to be ready for ransomware attack. I think the Colonial Pipeline, they never even dreamed that it would happen to them, which is hard to believe since it was happening in that infrastructure sector. But don't forget physical security. You know, there's a lot of security technology now in human security. Don't replace your security guard force because you're using drones or whatever. That's an extreme example, but it is happening at some airports. Just remember that human security is needed, because until artificial intelligence gets a little bit better, where they can detect people sweating and lying and shifty eyes, and you know, if people pass by today and they come by a couple days from now, you connect that dot in your brain, like I've seen them before, things like that. So just be careful. And with technology that you do buy, make sure that it's left of bang, okay? Make sure that it prevents an attack, not after the fact. So for instance, cameras, you know, they're good for collecting information and evidence after the attack, but they're not going to jump off the wall and get between someone and a bullet, for instance. Gunshot detection system, that's after the attack. So think prior to the attack, screening visitors, you know, and screening shouldn't start at the front door. It needs to be out of the facility, not in your facility, in your lobby, once they've come in the lobby, for instance. That's the layered defense. But think about that. Think about your left of bang before you buy any kind of security technology or any kind of anything. Just think, what did that do to prevent an attack? And just kind of use that as a sanity check. So there's a lot to think about. It's a very complicated issue, but some final thoughts, you know, don't think about probability and what are the odds this is going to happen at our place or with our people. Don't try to predict it. Don't try to think about the likelihood, but really focus on vulnerability. What is your vulnerability? Your preparedness to meet any kind of a threat, and the consequences. You know, you think about with risk management, you can't cover all your risks. You need to think about what if we can't cover this? What are the consequences? And this is what you should be focused on. And shape the environment and culture you want. Take control, be proactive, and get on the offensive. A lot of times with security, people are afraid to implement it because they're going to scare people away. They're not going to come visit, whatever else. People will still come. Okay, look at us at the airport taking off our shoes. You know, if they say look at powders, we take all that out. People are still going to come. People want security. People want to feel safe. So do it and don't apologize. If anybody's a member of ASIS, my session was approved for September, and I'm going to talk that whole thing about cross-applying the government strategies for insider threat to the private sector. Hope to see you there. And that's it. This is my contact information. I do live in Charleston, South Carolina. If anybody's local, I would love to grab coffee. Please reach out anytime. And everything I've talked about today, all these documents and everything, I'm happy to send it to you. So please reach out. And that's all. Thank you for attending.